Let's talk briefly about John Keats and his legacy as a British Romantic poet. One of the most commonly quoted lines from Keats's poetry is this one: "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." So I want you to keep the theme of beauty and truth in mind as you continue to read Keats's poetry and think about the Romantic period as a whole. So Keats himself died very young. He died at the age of 25. He ended up coming down with tuberculosis and not being able to live through it. At that time, medical practices weren't what they are today, so it was very common to not live to be super old, but still 25 was pretty young for that time period. His poetry used familiar forms to make it more accessible to mainstream audiences. Remember, the Romantic poets were pushing the boundaries of poetry. They were trying to make it accessible to as many people as possible and not just an intellectual activity anymore. And he used familiar forms, which I'll see if you can identify in a minute, in order to make people okay with this change, this shift in poetry. He was very prolific. For being only 25 years old, he wrote hundreds of poems. Many of them didn't become popular until after his death, which is very common for poets, but some of them did break through in the midst of all of the Romantic writers at the time. He was heavily influenced by the deaths of his mother and father, which, if you think back to our discussion on Wordsworth, is very similar, right? Wordsworth lost his parents and was very affected by that. Both Keats and Wordsworth tried to use their poetry to make sense of their feelings, to try and work through their grief. Keats was also a surgeon, so he was heavily influenced by not only nature, but by the human body as well. He was very fascinated by the sciences, and that comes through in his poetry. So some reminders. Remember, a sonnet is a 14-line poem that is written in iambic pentameter, meaning there are 10 beats per line, and it has an alternating rhyme scheme and a rhymed couplet. An ode is a tribute to something. It's a tribute poem. You're going to have to remember this because we may or may not be writing an ode coming up. So here's one of the poems that you're going to read today. "When I have fears that I may cease to be. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. When I behold upon that night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone, and think till love and fame to nothingness do sink." Hopefully you can identify what kind of poem this is. What kind of style is this written as? I'll give you a second to think about it. If we take a look at the lengths of the lines, the number of lines present, and the alternating rhyme scheme, hopefully you've identified this as a sonnet, because be and charactery rhyme, brain and grain, face and trace, romance and chance, hour and power, more and shore, and think and sink. So he used this familiar poetic form, but talked about very grand ideas. As the poetryfoundation.org describes, Keats's mission was to create poetry in a world devoid of mythic grandeur, poetry that sought its wonder and the desires and sufferings of the human heart. To simplify that phrase, basically Keats's job, his goal, was to write poems that would express large, emotional, fulfilled, beautiful ideas in a world that was otherwise very black and white, very stoic. And he wanted to express the wonders of life, all of the wonders of suffering, the wonders of desire, the wonders of love. He wanted to express all of that through his poetry. So even though he was an analytical and academic guy, and he was very young, he wanted to still be able to use his words to, like I said in the last video, make people feel things. He wanted to unite people on their shared experiences and shared emotions. So think of those things as you continue to read his poems. You're going to analyze this one and another one today, and you're going to take a look at more of his poetry tomorrow. So enjoy your time spent with Keats, and we will talk about him more later.